So this first episode, talking about the Great Law, I wanted to talk about some of the things that I think are important that often I think are overlooked in terms of the fundamentals about the Kayenerekowa and what it's all about. So one of the things that you see a lot of people going, if they're listening to this podcast, they might be wanting to research about the Great Law, about this Constitution of the Iroquois or the Mohawks or whoever. However, there's a variety of ways that people talk about it, so Haudenosaunee. And about this, people say it's the longest living democracy in the world, continuous. But I wanted to talk about it in a little bit different context about sort of how I was taught about it by my elders, and sort of a combination of studying the Kayenerekowa for its practical use, and also studying Kayenerekowa within the context of the language, and having the Kayenerekowa, my language, Kayenerekowa, it being one of the founding languages of the Kayenerekowa, can help give some context or understanding to the sort of meaning of things. So right away, I hear a lot of people get into funny debate or discussion or beliefs about what it is, what we call our system for making decisions and for solving, keeping things peaceful. And they use the English translation, the Great Law, or the Great Law of Peace, and that's a really common one, the Great Law of Peace, and they'll say in the language Kayenerekowa. So that's a little bit misleading. It gives the suggestion that we'll have a law that's that it's a law, first of all, that it's like this documented sort of a set of rules that everybody's required to follow, and that if they don't, then there's some sort of punishment, or like you can't break them, kind of. And it's not structured like that. And it also suggests the Great Law of Peace that is some sort of like supreme law of something. And it also suggests that it's some sort of pacifist law. When they say the Great Law of Peace, that it's some sort of like organizing constitution of pacifists, and that's not what Kayenerekowa is. And so when you look in the language, Kayenerekowa, the word means it's describing Kayenere, Uyanere. So when you have a path of people leaving footsteps, they're walking along in the snow or on the sand or something, and they leave their footprints in the snow. You're walking along, somebody comes along behind you walking, they'll step in your footprints, and then the one behind that one will come along and walk, and so on and so forth. And after a while, you got a path, but you don't really know how many people walked on that path. They just put their feet in the footsteps that was laid down before them. And so when we talk about Kayenerekowa, what we're saying is we're talking about this great path that was left. And what's there isn't the footprints, but rather the distance and the space between each of the steps. And so when we talk about Kayenerekowa, that word is describing the space between the steps, and it's this great path that was laid down before us by our ancestors. And so, if you really understand Kayenerekowa as a process for making decisions, a process for having a peaceful existence and a peaceful life, it's a euphemism of what it is it's It's a path to move forward that's proven. It's been done before, many, many times before you. It works. And so our laws, they often refer to them like in two contexts. They talk about them in the context of it being a path or footsteps, or like it's been laid down before us. I guess three contexts. And then oftentimes there's euphemisms, and there's just, it's talked about like as a tree. A great law is a tree, and that its branches stick out above us and provide us with shelter. So Kayenerekowa doesn't make any reference to that tree, but as we get through this podcast, we'll talk about Kayenerekowa in a variety of ways, and oftentimes a great tree becomes part of the story, but more it is used to describe there being having shelter, that people being able to that this laws, this path that's been put before us, that if we follow it, it'll lead us in the same direction. If we follow all of the things that our ancestors laid out about what to do in this situation and what to do in that situation, it's the symbolism of placing our feet in the right spot, and that we will wind up in the same place, in a peaceful place. We'll be we won't be in turmoil. We won't be in misery. We'll be fairly tranquil and content. Too often the words peace get used to describe things that in our language we're talking about more as contentment or more as tranquil. But we translate into English because the English are people who colonized our lands, and so that's the word they translate this word, this skana, to mean. And in English, peace means the absence of war. And in our language, in Kayenerekowa or in Kayenerekowa, skana, it's one of the founding principles of Kayenerekowa. It's one of the things we're seeking to acquire or to maintain in our lives, skana. It doesn't mean the absence of war. It means more like tranquility, like calmness. So we'll say things like when the kids are acting up. The kids are acting up, and they're arguing with one another, or they're getting bickering, and they're being a little bit too loud, and maybe they're a little bit rambunctious. We'll say in the language, hey, skina. And we'll say, it's kind of even the tone of it is a little bit harsh. And what you're saying to them, you're scolding them, you're saying to them, be peaceful. Like, have a little bit of, and it's like you're commanding them to do it in a way just a little bit. Like, hey, just be peaceful a little bit, skina. Like, be tranquil, just be calm, settle down. That means that kind of thing. Hey, settle down, calm down. So that's the meaning of that. So that's a big difference than the Great Law of Peace, when really our ancestors' path to tranquility is more like what it means, that they sat down for us to follow. And I feel like that's really important, a way to start understanding about our way of thinking and how to apply this, because I watch people. I maybe even participated in this kind of behavior. I don't remember when, but I think I should have, or I may have, or whatever. But I've certainly seen other people do it. They'd go and they'd find a written copy of the Great Law, Kayenerekowa, and they'd go, Wampum 58 says, so-and-so, if they do this, then that, right? And so then they run around and be like, you broke the law. And then they want to try to use this Wampum 72 against you, right? Because that's a colonial way of thinking about laws. That they're these things that you can't break, and if you break them, then there's punishments for them. And our way of doing it, it's not like that. It's a system that is a system of things that have come over time that are proven, and it's consistent. And so if you're following Kayenerekowa in your thinking process and in the way in which you're making decisions with a group of people, this is my opinion, now this little part, that you will basically always arrive at the same result. Because our ancestors showed us the way, how to go about it, and how to think about things. So it's sort of funny because in our system, in Kayenerekowa, there's one of these little rules. We deal with each circumstance on its own, all its own context, and its own, who the players are, and what's the issue, and how. So maybe you have a circumstance where somebody's killed somebody, and then a few years later you have a circumstance where somebody's killed somebody. The outcome and the solution for the addressing the issue may be very different between them, and how it gets played out in terms of how it gets dealt with can be very different, even though people follow all the same set of path, because the final outcome is that everything's going to be tranquil and everything's going to be peaceful and things are going to be okay. But how they get dealt with may be very different. It's the result that will be the same. So that's very different than European colonial ideas about laws, because they say this is the law, you are only allowed to drive 100 kilometers an hour, and if you go 105, then you break the law, and then there's a consequence, and the consequence is you got to pay a fine, let's say. And then, so that's the law, and that's the consequence, and that's what happens if you break it. And if you break it 3 times, they take your driver's license from you or something like that. In Kayenerekowa, they don't work like that. It says if you go 100 kilometers an hour, and then everybody will be going the same speed, and no one will bump into each other. And if you disregard everybody and being concerned about their well-being and you bump into everybody, then we're going to have to talk about that. It's a different way of dealing with it. Right? But maybe you got to go 125 one day, but nobody's out there and you're not going to cause any harm on anybody, so no one would care. It's a different way of thinking, right? So I have to get a sip of coffee. I think in this podcast, I'm always going to drink coffee. I think so. That's what we'll do. So that's a very important thing, just to begin to talk about the idea that Kayenerekowa is a path. And it's the spaces between the footsteps that were left. That's what we're following. And it guides us in a certain direction. So if you like this podcast and you want to hear more of this sort of stuff, please check out our Patreon, become a subscriber, make a donation, like us on Facebook, like this channel on your YouTube, subscribe, and be supportive. And I'll keep making this stuff. Have a good one.